Hi, and welcome to this week's Pastors Forum. I'm Byron Tyler. Glad to have you along as we welcome Dr. Noel Hutchinson of the First Baptist Church at Lauderdale in Memphis, our city. First Baptist Church Lauderdale has a rich history, goes back to the late 1800s, and we're going to learn more about it. And the pastor now, I believe you're pastor number 7. Is that right, Pastor?
Yes.
Originally, I learned that you're from the Bronx, New York.
Yes, sir.
I'm interested to hear the story of growing up there in New York and how you got to Memphis.
Well, I'm going to give you the abridged version of how I, growing up in the Bronx and how I got to Memphis. Well, first of all, growing up in New York is just interesting. You encounter a hodgepodge of different peoples and nationalities, and really, it's really, when you look at America, we talk about we're a melting pot. We're more like a fruit bowl or a salad bowl. And when you grow up in a place like New York, you're in the midst of the salad bowl. You interact with people from different backgrounds.
What was life like for you growing up in the Bronx?
Well, the time I grew up in the Bronx was very interesting. I grew up right after, I was born in the South Bronx, grew up right after they constructed the Cross Bronx Expressway. And what that did is carve neighborhoods up to the point where you had a lot of flight from the neighborhoods. And so by the time I was in my teen years in the 70s, that's when you would see pictures of the Bronx looking like it was a war zone. You see maybe 1 or 2 houses on the street, rubble everywhere in certain neighborhoods, that sort of thing. And so I also grew up during a time when hip-hop was born, and I also grew up during a time when we saw how that had kind of quelled some of the pending gang violence that was coming our way, but hip-hop was born, kind of intersected that and stopped it. So it was just an interesting time to be alive. New York was quite a different place then than it is now.
What about your family life? Parents, mother, dad, siblings?
All right. Grew up as an only child, both parents in the home, Christian home. Both of my parents were originally from Jamaica, knew each other from when they were in about the 8th grade. Grew up Episcopalian, so the whole 9 with that. So grew up to love and know God.
What kind of work did your dad do?
Well, he was in the printing profession, and my mother was a registered nurse and midwife. So that's basically some of that background. So it was interesting.
So you had a relationship with your parents taking you to church regularly?
Oh, my God. No choice. I had the no choice type of relationship in terms of going to church. It was a must. It was non-negotiable. You were going. And if you didn't feel like going to church, then that meant you didn't feel like doing anything else for the rest of the day. I know many of the listeners can identify with that.
What about, Pastor, your journey with Jesus Christ? Even though, of course, growing up in the church, we know doesn't make anybody a Christian any more than sitting inside a mechanic shop makes you an automobile,
Exactly.
But so there had to be a point in your life when you realized that Jesus Christ did something special for you on the cross.
It was interesting in this story. I'm going to try and abridge the story. It's interesting. By the time it was, I guess, time for me to go to college, I had decided, I had enough of church. I was not going to be bothered with church. I was going to do my own thing. And so I started off at Brandeis University, and even the way I got to go to Brandeis is just interesting. I don't know if we have enough time to really get into that, but the bottom line is I was waitlisted. I didn't want to go to Brandeis. My mother wanted me to go. I was filling out the applications because really, outside of, technical type school, I was the first person in the family to really go to college in this way. So I was filling out my own paperwork. So when it came to the house, if the deadline to get it in was, I would say, April the 1st, I sent the paperwork back like April the 2nd, just to make sure that I could say I sent it back and also make sure that it didn't get in. But guess what? Not only did I get in, they sent me the financial aid package at the same time while I was waiting on the financial aid package from Boston University where I wanted to go. So long story short, wound up at Brandeis, and I said, goodbye, God, I'm going to college. I don't want to be bothered with the church. Don't want to be bothered with anything with the church. Make a long story short, wound up in the gospel choir.
At college?
At college. And that summer gave my life to Jesus Christ.
Now, when you went to school, you majored in sociology and also American studies.
Yes, sir.
At that point, what were your goals? What were your dreams? What did you want to try to do career-wise?
I was looking at some type of social work, probably. I after graduation, thought about, because back then, just having a degree kind of gave you a position to do several things. Bounced around a little bit, then started looking at how I could use this sociology degree to get into social work, worked in non-secure detention, and was really starting to prepare myself to perhaps go to graduate school for social work. And then I got called to preach. So that kind of changed the apple cart on all of that, changed the trajectory, period.
And that specific call, what was that like? What were the circumstances? You had that clear, definite call that you were going to be a gospel preacher.
One night I was reading in the book of Amos, somewhere around the 7th chapter, the 14th verse. It says something like this: I was no prophet or nor a prophet's son, but I was a tender of sycamore fruit. And the Lord called me from the midst of his people and said, go prophesy to my people Israel. The print on the Bible got 3 times its size, and it was literally jumping off the page. When that happened, it scared me. Closed the Bible, didn't read anymore for the night. Every time I opened it after that and peek at that verse, same thing would happen. Went to a Bible study. We had a home Bible study in my church, because by then I was Baptist. I was at a church where I could walk to, and I went to church. And we were in a Bible study, and the deacon was leading this particular Bible study. He said, God often speaks to us through his word. And as soon as he said that, I opened the Bible at that passage. The same thing happened. So now I'm reading another night, and, basically it says in Jeremiah, and the same thing happened. Before you were born, I knew you, I called you, and I ordained you. Same thing happened. That's Jeremiah chapter 1. Jumps off the page. So by now, I'm crazy. I go and talk to my pastor, and he was like, well, if you could do anything else in this world but preach, that's what you ought to do. And I agreed with that. I said, well, if the Lord wants me to preach, the Lord's going to have to tell me point blank, because other than that, I'm not going. I was smart enough to know I couldn't run, but I also knew if I wasn't clear, I couldn't do it.
Yeah.
So I was in church, and Romans 1:15, they were reading, a deaconess got up and read the scripture for the day. When she got to Romans 1:15, where it says something like, I'm ready to preach the gospel in Rome also, print did the same thing. And then the Lord said to me, I want you to preach, go. And then I'm sitting in church arguing with the Lord. Lord, is that you? So at one point the Lord said, you heard what I said for you to do. So eventually I got up, told the church, rest is history.
So really God did speak to you through his word several times and made it clear that he wanted you in the ministry.
Mm-hmm. Because if it wasn't clear, I wouldn't have done it. And I remember a grandmother brought a grandson to me once and said that her grandson's been called to preach. So I said, young man, what makes you know that you're called to preach? Well, I like to help people. I said, young man, social workers help people. I said, you have to know beyond the shadow of a doubt that you're called to preach. And if you don't know, then you ought not do it, because sometimes the only thing that's going to keep you doing it is the fact that you know that God told you to do it. In many ways, in the church, we have done people a disservice. They see the marquee side of the call. In other words, they see Sunday morning, you're sitting on a high platform or in the front of the church. you're speaking to large crowds or even a crowd. People tend to listen to what you have to say. The whole trappings of what people think is success. But they don't understand that for every minute that you have that moment, you have hours of drudgery. It's not easy. It's challenging. And because of that, when the challenges come, I think people tend to get discouraged because it's really not easy to pastor. And if you really attempt to fulfill your call, it's not easy because you're going diametrically against the world. You're dealing with principalities and powers. You're dealing with spiritual wickedness in high places. And now, think about it for a minute. That's happening with the average Christian. And now, God has called you from amongst the people to be a leader in the midst of the people. So now what do you think will happen if you're a leader? The Bible says somewhere, hit the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. So that's part of what happens when you get this calling on you. So that's why I know, not I think, but I know you have to be sure.
You were called to a historic church back when you were in a youth minister position several years ago, quite a few years ago, earlier in your ministry. But and then you had this opportunity to come to an historic church, First Baptist Lauderdale here in Memphis. What was that like for you?
Let me back up for a minute. I was able, because of the type of pastor I had and the insistence of him, to get trained. And I was around a lot of older preachers, and I would listen to them. Went to our ministers' conference, would listen to them. So I was able to get mentors that could really lead me and guide me. And when the smoke cleared and I graduated from seminary in 91, I was able to go to Concord Baptist Church in Brooklyn. And the pastor emeritus was Gardner C. Taylor, known as one of the best preachers in the English-speaking world. Now, I know I'm biased. I just think he was the best preacher, period. He just recently died in April at about 96 years old, an awesome preacher, but a more awesome Christian. And so going to that type of setting enabled me to touch and rub shoulders with people in a length and breadth of society, was able to meet Nelson Mandela, was able to meet other persons and personalities because of my connection with that church. And the way that fits with this scenario, when I was looking to pastor, I never forget Dr. Taylor was preaching his anniversary service at the Concord Church, and his first wife, who met with an accident, was hit by a snowplow. And matter of fact, she died the day I accepted the pulpit at First Baptist. The three of us were in the office talking, and she overheard Dr. Taylor say to me, "Well, I'm looking into some places to recommend you." And she said, "Gardner, what about Charlie Dinkins?" That was my predecessor at First Baptist. He said, "Oh, yes, First Baptist in Memphis. I'll put in a good word for you." Dr. Dinkins and Dr. Taylor were classmates at Oberlin in Ohio. I think Dr. Taylor was there in the seminary while Dr. Dinkins was in undergrad, and then Dr. Dinkins went into the seminary. So they crossed paths for about 4 or 5 years up in Oberlin. So they knew each other well.
I'll tell you, Pastor, before we continue this conversation, this is very interesting. I'm excited that you're sharing the background here and just the connection of the people that God used in your life to influence you, to lead you, to guide you in the ministry. But our time slipped away on this show. But before we say goodbye, is there a website or a contact information that our listeners can find out more information about First Baptist Lauderdale?
All right. First Baptist Lauderdale is at 682 South Lauderdale Street. If you go to firstbaptistlauderdale.org, that's the website, and the phone number is 901-523-0501.
Okay, we're going to say goodbye here, but come back and join our listeners next week if that's okay with you.
That's perfectly fine.
All right. Well, friends, that's all the time we have on this week's Pastors Forum. Dr. Noah Hutchinson of First Baptist Lauderdale here in Memphis, our guest. We'll continue the conversation next week right here on Pastors Forum. I'm Byron Tyler. We'll talk to you then. Bye-bye.